Today is our second webinar on our AI governance web series. We will be focusing on key foundations for EU AI Act readiness. And we'll talk about what readiness is and what we mean by that shortly. So to introduce myself, my name is Jacob Beswick. I'm the Director for AI Governance Solutions at Dataiku. I lead a globally operating team. We work with organizations in different regions who are operating in different sectors to support with their kind of translation of AI governance requirements or processes into our product Govern. And you'll see a little bit of Govern today. So to move along, a relatively short agenda should take about 30 minutes. So first I'll kick off with a quick review of the previous webinar, which was focused on unpacking the EU AI Act. We'll talk about what readiness is, why it matters. We'll talk about kind of what we think are some key considerations around EU Act readiness. So we'll talk about them in terms of organizational foundations and technical foundations. In terms of unpacking, it's high level. So in case you are unfamiliar or you need a refresher, what is the EU Act about? It's concerned with promoting the uptake of human-centric and trustworthy AI while ensuring a high level of protection of health, safety, fundamental rights, protecting against effectively harmful effects of AI systems. And what are some of the key interventions? So we covered this in some detail in our last webinar, but just to recap, the three that we went in detail on are here. The first is a new risk tiering with associated requirements in relation to those risk tiers. So they extend from prohibited AI systems, which can't be placed on the market, high-risk systems, which have quite extensive new requirements associated with them, limited risk AI systems, which have transparency obligations, and minimal risk AI systems, which have no mandatory or compliance-related requirements associated. We talked about the fact that the EU AI Act positions the limited risk and minimal risk tiers in a way that it associates with them with voluntary kind of governance practices, and those voluntary governance practices are discussed in relation to the high risk tier. So basically selecting some level of the requirements associated with the high risk tier and applying them to those other less risky tiers. Before I move on, I want to highlight the premise of extraterritoriality. So all of the above that we're going to be mentioning now apply to organizations that are based in the EU and operating within the EU, but also based outside of the EU, but either operationalizing AI systems within the EU or selling AI systems into the EU. The second thing we covered includes the topic of general purpose AI models. So the new kind of expectations around these models, as well as the expectations or requirements assigned to model providers and the consequences of this for downstream users. And then we also discussed the penalty regime, and what you see on the screen is the kind of most extensive part of the penalty regime. So up to 35 million euros or up to 7% of annual worldwide turnover for the previous financial year. And this relates to non-compliance in relation to the kind of prohibited AI system tier. The final bit of recap, we discussed timelines. We're still waiting on the publication of the Act in the official journal, at which point 20 days will expire, and following that will be a cascade of new requirements hitting the market. While all that's happening, we discussed basically we're expecting things like guidance, guidelines, codes of conduct to come from European Union institutions and other related parties, which are designed to support with compliance. So that's our recap. Let's just quickly dive into what readiness is and why it matters. Icebreakery slide. So really readiness is about, rather than diving headfirst into a huge wave, maybe studying the wave, planning for it, and skillfully navigating it. More relevantly, what are we talking about? So readiness focuses on raising awareness, enhancing understanding, establishing solid foundations to facilitate effective implementation of future compliance activities. It's beneficial insofar as it helps to reduce future compliance costs by doing that careful planning and navigation. So you're not succumbing to hasty implementations of things like change management or technical systems that might speak to governance processes or support them. I'm going to dive into what we're going to cover today. So look, this is my view of the world given my experience. So this is not going to be exhaustive. For the sake of this webinar, we'll talk about 5 kind of key foundations to readiness. The first, which we kind of touched on already with that recap, is the idea of regulatory understanding as a foundation to readiness. So here, for each of these, I'll discuss kind of like the lowest possible kind of competency and the highest possible competency, and we'll figure out basically You can maybe play around with figuring out where you sit. So in terms of regulation understanding, you might imagine the lowest possible competency is that there's absolutely no awareness about the EU AI Act, right? Nobody knows it exists within an organization. Nobody's familiar with the new requirements and so forth, whereas a high or maximal kind of competency would speak to things like complete understanding of the act, including the steps needed for future compliance, which is kind of not really present today anywhere because we're not yet privy to those guidelines and codes of conduct. So I'm going to give you just examples. So you can imagine an organization sitting somewhere between perhaps one that has some awareness of across the organization, but ultimately their understanding is still evolving. The next foundation that we will cover is on leadership. So it's this idea at the lowest kind of setting. Leadership lacks awareness about the EU AI Act. They've not prioritized it in any way, and they haven't sponsored it or set out an owner of future compliance activities or readiness activities. At the maximal setting, we'd imagine that there is a sponsor, that they have a strategy for getting the organization aligned to readiness, as well as have some notion of what a rollout plan, both for the readiness, but also future compliance activities would look like. And so you might imagine a scenario which is very real, like very plausible today and is happening today, where leadership is beginning to understand and learn about the EU AI Act, and they're deliberating on who should own it, who should drive it forward. Responsibilities, this is really kind of concerned with operational level. So for example, at the lowest setting, you might imagine teams are, again, unaware and oblivious about the EU AI Act. They are very likely prioritizing other things, kind of a mandate set by leadership to build really effective and efficacious AI or data science pipelines, and that's their priority, which is very reasonable. At the highest setting, you'd imagine that responsibilities, accountabilities, informed parties are well defined, and key owners are in place. So again, just to give this color, some scenarios, and this presents its own challenge, reflect the fact that multiple teams are driving EU AI Act readiness. AI governance, we'll unpack all of these later, but AI governance really is oriented around, the way we define it is a framework that basically sets rules, requirements, and processes that shape how AI systems are designed, developed, and deployed, aligned to some set of organizational priorities. So you might find that some organizations have absolutely no AI governance in place today, or it's highly varied and kind of informal. At the highest level, you would imagine AI governance in terms of policies and processes that are basically designed around what's expected from the EU AI Act. And you can imagine again that, and which is a reality in many organizations, governance processes vary widely. And then the final foundation we'll cover is tooling. On one end, there's no tooling foundations in place to support with readiness, and in the other, we have tooling foundations that are quite solid. Technical features or tooling have been kind of scoped, aligned to what's expected from the EU AI Act, and so there's a fitness element here. And you might imagine that, unfortunately, I've got an arrow in the middle of my screen, so I can't see my bottom column, my bottom row. Some tooling foundations exist, but these are not yet standardized. So we'll use this as a guide, and over the next couple sections of the presentation, we'll talk about the first group as organizational foundations and the second group as technical foundations. So kicking off with organizational foundations. So in this section, I'm going to discuss what would mostly be associated with strategic or change management considerations. I consider these foundations for readiness because they set an organization on the right track in terms of helping to set expectations, potentially anticipating and removing frictions, and putting readiness forward. So basically it's fast-tracked or a track to compliance. I will caveat, this domain generally would fall to leadership or to strategic roles within an organization, as well as to the likes of like management consultancies who provide both strategic insights as well as support on change management. Extending the caveat, I am neither of these things. However, experiences from our engagement with organizations globally kind of helped me build up a view on this. So I'll share that with you. Before I dive in, I want to imagine a scenario to kind of give this color. So imagine leadership does not provide support, resulting in unclear goals and insufficient resources around the EU AI Act. We might imagine AI delivery teams are working in silos, missing out on shared knowledge that they might be bubbling up within them, and as a result, creating unique and ultimately inconsistent practices. And then any kind of AI risk management is ultimately disconnected from those delivery teams, and this leads to unmanaged risks and potential non-compliance. So over the next 3 slides, I'm going to expand on these elements within this situation. I'm going to focus on leadership, readiness, and governance foundations. In terms of the leadership foundation, so referring back to the high competency for leadership foundation earlier, arguably the ideal state is for leadership to support readiness through sponsorship, pushing out a strategy and rollout plan that ultimately leads the organization towards compliance. In our situation, leadership is largely inactive, and it's worth understanding what's driving that lack of support, the lack of goals, the insufficient resources. First, we might think of leadership as being unprepared. They're completely unaware of the EU AI Act. It's not on their radar as they have other priorities. And as a result, the AI Act, much less readiness towards it or around it, has never been considered, and it's unclear if it will be or when it will be. Second, we might dig a little deeper as to why this is the case. One scenario is that ownership and therefore sponsorship for AI Act readiness just doesn't naturally sit with anybody at the leadership level. The chief legal officer has a vested interest, but isn't positioned to dictate what teams should be doing differently. A CDO might be interested in debating whether or not it falls in their remit, but can find reasons why it doesn't. And finally, if there's no chief AI officer, there's just no one single person to jump at ownership. An extension of this scenario is that either no single leader claims responsibility or multiple leaders attempt to grab it at the same time with equally kind of tenuous justifications. So what are the risks associated with this scenario? We see a number, including just in general risk exposure and bottlenecks. So without preparation and clear sponsorship, we see that across the organization, readiness isn't prioritized. So not just at a leadership level. It's not embedded into ongoing AI activities, and consequently AI projects get pushed to deployment, which creates a governance backlog. And with this backlog, the potential volume for high-risk use cases, it can grow. And all of this happens without necessary controls, and we'll talk about controls later and more so in another webinar. So if we focus on the sponsorship problem, we see opportunities for tensions at the leadership level that cascade down to tensions at the operational level. All of this results in delays for readiness and future compliance. I'll touch now on the responsibilities foundation. So referring back to the high competency for responsibilities, arguably the ideal state is for responsibilities and accountabilities to be well articulated. So the key owners for readiness and future compliance are in place. In our situation, while AI delivery teams are working in silos, there's no formal readiness practices in place, and everything that happens is oriented at another mission, very likely productive and well-executed AI pipelines. So let's explore how this could play out. Let's assume that some teams become aware of the AI Act and decide to look for organization-level resources to help them with readiness. But there's a lack of clarity around ownership. There's no notion of whether there's an acting epicenter for AI Act readiness. And in this context, we might imagine that this is frustrating. It inspires someone somewhere to take up the mantle because a team has become self-proclaimed or de facto epicenter for readiness, but in a context without a mandate from leadership. And as a result, they're not integrated into the community of AI system builders, and all they do all the work they're doing is reactive. So they're only ever reacting to somebody if they make a request. They can't be proactive because they don't have that support. So what are the risks? So in this scenario, we see ambiguity around readiness, inefficiencies, and a lot of potentially wasted effort. Individuals and teams with increasing awareness and interest in the AI Act don't know where to turn to for direction. And they spend time, spending time on finding this creates inefficiencies. This is all the more so if they can't find a resource that might exist. If there is no resource, then a team or multiple teams concurrently might say, you know what, this is our thing. In either case, more inefficiencies are created by virtue of having to lobby internally, both laterally and vertically, for legitimacy. And this is a source of tension on the one hand, but also a disservice to any kind of readiness work that might be happening. And then the final foundation for the organizational level, again, which are kind of more strategic oriented, whoops, too far, AI governance. So it's a topic that I think is a little more complex. Maybe because I make it more complex, but anyway, here we go. I think the main question that has to be asked and answered is whether current governance practices that exist can be adapted to support with readiness and ultimately compliance. And the condition for answering this question is ultimately mapping or knowing what's actually happening, but then being able to align or fit what's actually happening to what's expected from the AI Act. So this is where that regulatory understanding foundation is really important. So Answering this question, as I mentioned, relies on understanding existing AI governance practices. And it so happens that this sometimes results in finding that no formalized AI governance exists within a company, much less across teams. And this is all the more challenging when governance activities exist at a team level, which have evolved to suit the context of a given team, but are not thought of in terms of governance. So for example, documentation practices, review practices, and so on. We might imagine a scenario where there's a complete lack of formalized practices, and extending this scenario, we can envision teams with their specific governance activities being so different functionally that there's just no common view on what AI governance is across an organization, which translates into a lack of a starting point for readiness. So what are the risks? In this context, when looking at the topic of readiness and whether existing AI governance can be leveraged towards it, it's exposure to a significant amount of time and work. Basically, it's a time suck. This takes shape as building and understanding of current practices on the one hand, which itself relies on the availability and generosity of individuals across teams to talk through what exactly they do. And with diverse or decentralized governance processes at play, doing any mapping to the EU Act becomes challenging and labor intensive. And in the worst case, it leads to individuals and teams taking up this exercise independently, which introduces the potential for hyper decentralization of readiness, otherwise known as reinventing the wheel. So that's like the dire and low end of the spectrum for leadership readiness and governance. We'll just talk about, well, what can we do? There are no magic bullets, unfortunately, but just a bit of guidance or a bit of a recommendation that's very light touch. And basically, all of the recommendations here honestly take a lot of work, but it's worth just saying them out loud. So thinking about the leadership function, ultimately, depending on where you sit in an organization, if you think this is important, if you don't think leadership's paying enough attention to it, yeah, I would advocate you become an advocate. And being an advocate really just means supporting by informing them on the EU AI Act, what it is, what are the potential consequences for your organization, perhaps what needs to change or what should be considered in terms of changes. In terms of responsibilities, don't assume that nothing exists. I've seen too many times where people make that assumption, they kick off that kind of reinventing the wheel scenario, and then there's doubling work, which again really does create tensions and it eats time. So I really advocate identifying if and where any kind of readiness programming is happening today, and get ready to work with others. So, you know, this is a quote team sport. So get ready that you will not be the sole advocate or lead here, and you're going to have to work closely with very diverse groups of people who are invested in this. And then finally, on the AI governance topic, it's kind of similar to the previous one. I really advocate that you explore your organization and figure out what AI governance looks like today. And then if there is any material kind of investment and practices, explore how they line up to the EU AI Act. And if they do, then they can be part of kind of your readiness approach. And we'll talk about the technical elements next, which will give this a bit more color. So let's pivot to the technical foundations. This is really oriented at practical considerations before it was very high level strategic. I'm going to start with imagining a situation. Let's just imagine a very different scenario. Leadership's aligned. They know who's responsible. They've a defined notion of their risk appetite, their approaches towards the act. There's a central team taking on the EU Act interpretation implications. So they're kind of setting up the scope of what behaviors need to look like within the company. And then there's maybe a program team or a center of excellence or a board that's defining the practices. So they're receiving the inputs from that central team. They're defining the practices that need to be implemented with a view to changing behaviors and getting people ready for compliance activities down the line. Now, these slides look very different. So this is what I would argue a first consideration in this space. So it's this idea of readiness from the perspective of AI system awareness. So I don't know where you work, but I do know that many organizations are investing in the scaling of AI, right? And so today they might have some number of use cases for AI systems at play. But the vision, a leadership vision, or even a management level vision for using AI to reap the rewards of efficiencies and optimizations is very tangible. And so that means that more AI systems are going to come into development or procurement and use tomorrow, down the line, 6 months, a year ahead. In this context, and when we think about the EU AI Act, we know that we have the burden of qualifying AI systems. We know we need to associate them with a risk tier, and that risk tier is the gateway to kind of knowing what requirements that we have to meet. And so from a readiness perspective, we need to know our AI systems. So we have to ask ourselves questions like, what AI systems exist in the organization today? What's their status? Are we developing them? When are we procuring them? Are they deployed? If they're not yet deployed, when do we plan to deploy them? And then the kind of sanity check that I think everybody should ask themselves at some regular period of time is, do I feel confident that I'm aware of everything? Which, you might not, and that's okay. It's an impetus to keep on top of things. So how do you answer this? Is we're going to dip a little bit into the world of Dataiku. We ask ourselves these questions, and the ways in which we answer them are going to be shared. So asking and answering on the topic of what are the AI systems at play? What you're looking at is govern. This is the space where a lot of our governance functionality lives. And you're looking at the governable items page. So the governable items page is synced with the space where you're building your AI systems. So you create a project, you initiate a project in what we call the design node. It automatically shows up in the govern node, and you are able to then govern it. In addition to that, we have registries, right? So we want to know, okay, if I want to know all my AI systems at play, I also want to know all my models that exist, and I want to associate them with projects. So I'm able to dig into them this way. Bundles or snapshots of projects that are ultimately deployed. So basically every object that sits within a project, we know where it comes from, where it lives, its status of development. Whoops. I'm going to skip that for a moment. Status of development. So basically I know that this is pre-development, right? And I will have a stage which indicates deployment, and I'll know the point at which it's deployed and when we're in post-deployment stages. Now, keeping in mind that every organization, very likely organizations use multiple data science platforms, and answering the question, do I know all the AI systems that exist? Do I know where they live? Do I know what they're used for? Well, we'll get to that question in a moment. Means being able to keep an eye on all of the platforms that are used. And so for this reason, we're thinking in terms of how do you build those connections, right? How do you build that cross-organizational level of understanding? Here's something we built. It's a custom page that brings in, for example, Databricks models so that we can keep an eye on them. So every model that's created within Databricks is piped here, and alongside our Dataiku objects, we can keep track of our Databricks objects. So these are the kind of solutions to these questions that might work for you. But I'd recommend asking yourself those questions and thinking, given where you are and where you plan to be, how you can answer them. Moving along to general purpose AI awareness, look, these new obligations are hitting model providers, but there's an expectation that where these I'll call them GPay models are integrated into AI systems, we nonetheless have to govern those systems, right? So we have to answer questions like, what GPay models are we currently using? Do we have a subsidiary question, which I want to address now, is, do I have all the relevant documentation from the model provider? Next, we want to know, how are these being used or where? And then a question that I would recommend you ask and that I have no real answer for is a differentiating question. So what's my level of understanding relating to formal use, which is to say using these third-party models within AI systems, versus informal use, which is to say employee access to ChatGPT via a web browser. This is a bigger challenge from my perspective than this currently. So how we're addressing this. What you're looking at is our model registry. And so within our model registry, you click LLM. So I have a way to differentiate and understand all my projects or AI systems that feature a third-party LLM, which is very useful, because then I can also set expectations for these project owners in terms of having the right documentation associated with them. Once I have a full understanding of what compliance activity looks like. Whoops. Next, if I want to understand, well, what are all the GPay general purpose AI models that exist and are available to use across my data science teams? We have something called LLM Mesh. This is just basically a registry of all the models that have been active within our LLM Mesh. Next, if I want to isolate generative AI models at any time, I can do the approach I showed you initially, but I can also use a search function and search on the type of model, which is quite helpful. And then if I want to understand where and how they're being used, I use a project level description. So if I have a project or a business initiative and these models are being used there, for every project herein, I have descriptions of the use case or the AI system, and I can keep basically keep account of how these models are being used. And now we get to the idea of qualification, which is, I think we should all be starting on, right? We know what the high risk tier looks like. We know what it's comprised of, more or less. Same for the limited risk tier. We're at a stage where it's probably more helpful than not as a part of a readiness program to begin that qualification exercise and to kind of prepare your organization with an understanding of how much work will need to be done in terms of setting up kind of executing kind of compliance activities in the right way. So we have to ask ourselves, do we know the intended purpose of our AI systems across the organization? So can I go to any given, quote, AI system and have a very direct understanding of what is the intention of use here, and is it actually operating in a way that it was intended? Do I have sufficient information to begin qualifying projects, so by risk level in particular? And then do I have a way to systematically enforce this? This is something I've not really talked about yet, but it's this idea of, okay, if you need to do this, how do I make sure people are doing it? And the way we've addressed these questions, so you're looking at a Kanban view of my governed projects. I'm using what we call an EU AI Act Readiness solution. So it's a template that's oriented at it was based on the European Commission's version of the proposed AI Act. And here I can see basically all the projects that are being governed by their business area. And when I go a little bit deeper, if I click into one, up front, I know the use case intended purpose. I know the anticipated impacts. And then down the line, I can also have information about, is this performing in a way that was intended? But before I get to that, I can also begin to actually qualify. So with that intended purpose scoped, can I qualify that, yes, indeed, this is a high risk use case? So this is a very limited version of what we plan to do with the EU AI Act, but for now, this is the way in which we've been supporting customers from a readiness perspective. And then I was talking about enforcement. So how do I get people to do this? Which is a big question, right? How do I make sure that they're actually executing on this? We've been leveraging something called review sign-off. So this basically gates deployment so that everything as a final approver, if I'm the final approver, I make sure that all this information is filled out before it could ever be deployed. And so it's one vehicle aside from education to make sure that people are doing what they need to do in terms of asset qualification. And then the final kind of foundation that we think a lot about is accountability and ownership. So we're in a space for readiness, and we're kind of setting up the organization in a way that people who are managing or owning AI systems, but also business areas, need to be very proactive at the point of compliance. We want to make sure that they are properly associated with all the assets that technically they either own or sponsor. And so we have to ask questions like, can you identify AI systems and risk levels by business area? And as part of this, can you identify a sponsor for that business area? And are there clear lines of accountability established for business areas and AI systems? And the way in which we answer these is as such. So you're now looking at government projects again. Here, I can target the business area. And within the business area, you can see I'm the sponsor. So this is the person. I am the person who will be responsible for all HR use cases for AI systems. And so there will be expectations for me, and I should have expectations set on my side that as compliance hits, I might have new responsibilities. With respect to this matrix, I can at a glance have an understanding of all the AI systems that I am responsible for and where they sit in terms of risk. So if I have a number of high risk use cases, I know that a lot will be expected of me at the point of compliance. And then in terms of who are accountable, who are the owners of projects, but also development processes, I can ultimately have them associated at any given time and call on them as needed. And also prepare them for when we figure out what compliance looks like, prepare them that they will need to do things a little bit differently. So just to kind of summarize, look, this isn't exhaustive, but I think there are important considerations, technical foundations. The first is AI system awareness and qualification. I would really challenge you actually to think in terms of, can you map out all the AI systems at play in your organization today? And if you can, or even if you can't, do you have a way of qualifying those systems so that once you're ready, your organization is ready for compliance, or you must be compliant, you can quite seamlessly execute on that? And do you have the ability or technical means of identifying all the relevant parties for business areas, but also projects or systems and the development processes? that's it. It was a short webinar. It feels like I zoomed through, but I leave you with a couple questions to ask yourselves, which have already been asked throughout the session, but just to repeat, do you know all the AI systems currently operationalized in development across your organization, but also being procured? We must not forget that. Are you confident about the associated risk levels of those systems, and can you qualify them? And is there a team, or are there teams in your organization that are actually doing the readiness work? Do you know if they exist? And if you do, can you name the people in them? And I advocate, if you can, and if you can do both, I'd advocate you reach out. What's next from us? So we're going to do another webinar late August, focusing a little bit more generically on building a system of trust, and there will be a bigger, kind of a more in-depth exposition of Govern and what it can do in this space. And that's it. So thank you very much for attending. Feel free to reach out to me. My email is here. And I'm happy to field questions if you have any.